March 17, 1943. Gafsa, Tunisia. General George S. Patton Jr. stands in the desert heat, binoculars raised, scanning the horizon for German panzers. He's been preparing for this moment for weeks. Studying, planning, reading. On his desk sits a worn copy of a book titled Infantry Attacks, written by the man he's about to face, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Patton has memorized Rommel's tactics, his patterns, his thinking. He's convinced himself that he understands his enemy better than the enemy understands himself. American forces are about to launch their first major offensive since the humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass 4 weeks earlier. Patton has transformed a beaten, demoralized corps into an aggressive fighting force. Now comes the test. Patton is hunting Rommel, but there's something Patton doesn't know. Something that will define this entire campaign. 8 days ago, on March 9th, Rommel left North Africa. The Desert Fox is gone. The two greatest armor commanders of World War II, men who studied each other's tactics, respected each other's genius, and anticipated each other's moves, will never meet in battle. This is the story of the rivalry that never was, the duel that never happened, and the question that haunts military history: what did Patton really think about Rommel before he discovered the truth? February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. American soldiers are dying. The green, untested troops of the USII Corps face the full fury of Rommel's Afrika Korps for the first time. German tanks smash through American defensive lines. Panzer IVs and Tigers roll forward, guns blazing. American M3 Lee and M4 Sherman tanks try to respond, but their crews lack experience and their commanders make fatal errors. Within hours, the American position collapses. Soldiers retreat in panic. Equipment is abandoned. Within 10 days, the Americans suffered 183 tanks destroyed, 7,000 casualties, including 300 killed and 3,000 captured or missing. It's a disaster. The first major battle between American ground forces and the Wehrmacht ended in crushing defeat. German soldiers mocked the Americans as cowards. Rommel himself notes in his journal that the American troops are green, poorly led, and easily panicked. But Rommel knows something important: these Americans have courage. They lack training, discipline, and competent leadership. Give them those things, and they'll be formidable. Back in the United States, newspapers report the defeat with alarm. Is the American army ready for this war? Can American soldiers stand up to the battle-hardened Germans? In Tunisia, the Allied High Command knows something must change. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in North Africa, makes a decision. He relieves Major General Lloyd Fredendall, commander of II Corps. Fredendall's leadership has been disastrous. He commanded from a bunker 70 miles behind the front lines. He dispersed his forces in violation of basic tactical doctrine. He failed to coordinate with British forces. He lost the confidence of his men. Eisenhower needs someone who can restore the American fighting spirit, someone aggressive. Someone who understands armored warfare, someone who won't back down. On March 6, 1943, George S. Patton Jr. took command of II Corps. The transformation is immediate and shocking. Patton arrives wearing his ivory-handled revolvers, polished boots, and a stern expression that promises hell for anyone who doesn't measure up. He immediately issues orders that seem almost petty. All soldiers must wear helmets, properly strapped, at all times. Neckties must be worn by officers, even in the desert. Vehicles must be painted and kept clean. Saluting is mandatory. Patton is establishing discipline through visible standards, but he's doing more than that. He's changing the culture. He's telling his men that they are professional soldiers, not defeated refugees. Within days, rigorous training regimens begin: live fire exercises, coordinated maneuvers, artillery practice, tank infantry coordination drills. The soldiers of II Corps begin to look like warriors again. Morale rises, But Patton knows that training alone won't win battles. He needs to understand his enemy. This is where the legend begins. Patton has always been a student of warfare. He devoured military history as a young officer. He studied Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Napoleon Bonaparte. He believed in reincarnation and claimed to remember fighting in past lives. Now, facing the greatest armor commander of the German army, Patton applies his scholarly instincts to a modern problem. He obtains a copy of Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks, written in 1937 about Rommel's experiences in World War I. The book details Rommel's tactics, aggressive movement, exploitation of terrain, use of surprise, and relentless pursuit of defeated enemies. Patton reads it carefully. He makes notes. He discusses it with his staff. "I know how he thinks," Patton tells his aides. "I've read his book. I know what he'll do." This confidence, whether justified or not, becomes central to Patton's self-image. He's convinced that he understands Rommel's mind. But here's the irony that nobody knows yet. Rommel's book is about infantry tactics in World War I, not armored warfare in 1943. And more importantly, by the time Patton finishes reading it, Rommel is already making plans to leave North Africa. The man Patton is preparing to fight is already preparing to depart. The date is March 9, 1943. Rommel stands in his headquarters in Tunisia. He looks exhausted, which he is. 2 years of almost constant combat in the desert have destroyed his health. He suffers from fainting spells, low blood pressure, rheumatism, and heart problems. His skin is yellowed with jaundice. His face and neck are covered with painful boils. The desert fox is sick, perhaps dying, but worse than his physical condition is his strategic situation. Rommel knows the war in North Africa is lost. The British 8th Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, is pushing from the east. The American and British 1st Army is pressing from the west. German and Italian forces are being squeezed into an ever smaller pocket in Tunisia. Supply lines across the Mediterranean are under constant attack from Allied aircraft and submarines. German reinforcements can't get through. Food and ammunition are running low. Rommel has begged Adolf Hitler to authorize a withdrawal from Africa, evacuate the troops, save them to fight in Europe. Hitler refuses. Every inch of ground must be defended. Hitler insists. There will be no retreat. Rommel realizes he's commanding a doomed army. On March 6th, the day Patton takes command of II Corps, Rommel launches what he knows will be his last offensive in Africa, the Battle of Medellin. It's a desperate attempt to hit Montgomery before the British can consolidate. Rommel throws 3 panzer divisions at the British defensive line. The attack fails. British anti-tank guns destroyed 52 German tanks. The panzers can't break through. Rommel pulls back, defeated again. 3 days later, on March 9th, Rommel received orders from Berlin. He's being recalled to Germany. Officially, it's for health reasons. Unofficially, everyone knows the truth. Hitler doesn't want Rommel in Africa when the final collapse comes. The Desert Fox has become too famous, too admired, too valuable to lose in a pointless last stand. Rommel is promoted to command of Army Group Africa, a meaningless title since he's leaving Africa. The actual command passes to General Hans-Eugen von Arnim. Rommel boards a plane and flies to Germany. He never returns to North Africa. His war in the desert is over. At this moment, Patton is planning his offensive. He doesn't know Rommel is gone. Nobody tells him. For the next several weeks, Patton believes he's fighting Rommel. He makes tactical decisions based on what he thinks Rommel will do. He speaks to his officers about anticipating Rommel's moves. He's fighting a ghost. March 17, 1943. Patton launches Operation WAP, a drive to capture the towns of Gafsa and El Guettar. The operation is designed to support Montgomery's offensive from the east by drawing German forces away from the British front. American troops move forward aggressively. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, takes Gafsa without opposition. Elements of the 1st Armored Division push toward El Guettar. Resistance is light. The Americans are moving fast, exactly as Patton planned. But where is Rommel? German defenders are falling back, but there's no sign of the massive panzer counterattack Patton expects. Has Rommel changed his tactics? Is this a trap? Patton remains cautious, convinced that Rommel is somewhere out there, planning something devastating. The truth is simpler. Rommel is in Germany, and General von Arnim is still consolidating his command. The German response is uncoordinated. March 23, 1943, dawn breaks over El Guettar. American infantry of the 1st Division holds defensive positions in the rocky terrain. Suddenly, at 6 in the morning, German tanks appear. The 10th Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite units, launches a massive counterattack. 57 panzers, supported by Panzergrenadier infantry, surge forward, intending to smash through the American line. This is the moment Patton has been waiting for. A chance to prove that American armor can beat German armor, but the battle doesn't go as anyone expects. The American infantry holds firm. Anti-tank guns open fire at close range. Tank destroyers from the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion maneuver into position and begin systematically destroying German panzers. The German attack, poorly coordinated and launched without adequate reconnaissance, runs into a killing field. By noon, the 10th Panzer Division had lost 30 tanks. The attack stalls. The Germans withdraw. It's the first time in the North African campaign that American forces have decisively defeated a German armored assault. Patton is jubilant. He believes he's beaten Rommel. Standing on a hill overlooking the battlefield, watching German tanks burn, Patton reportedly growls to his staff, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard. I read your book." It's one of the most famous quotes attributed to Patton. Whether he actually said it that day is debated by historians. The line certainly appears in the 1970 film Patton, which immortalized it, but the sentiment is real. Patton believed he had outsmarted Rommel by studying Rommel's tactics and preparing countermeasures. There's just one problem: Rommel had nothing to do with this battle. He wasn't there. He didn't plan it. He didn't command it. The 10th Panzer Division was acting under von Arnim's orders, and those orders were poorly conceived. Patton had defeated von Arnim, not Rommel. But Patton doesn't know this yet. For the next several weeks, as American and British forces continue to squeeze the Axis pocket in Tunisia, Patton continues to speak of Rommel. Intelligence reports mention German commanders, but Patton's focus remains on the Desert Fox. Other American generals notice something odd. German tactics seem different, less aggressive, less coordinated, less brilliant. Where is the famous Rommel flair? Montgomery, fighting on the Eastern Front, knows the truth. He knows Rommel is gone. British intelligence informed him on March 9th. But apparently, nobody thought to tell Patton, or perhaps the information didn't reach him in the chaos of the campaign. Either way, Patton continues his personal rivalry with a man who isn't his opponent anymore. The truth eventually comes out, though exactly when Patton learns it isn't clear from historical records. Some sources suggest he knew by early April. Others indicate he didn't realize until after the Tunisian campaign ended in May. What we know for certain is this: when Patton finally discovered that Rommel had left North Africa before their armies could meet, he was deeply disappointed. He'd built up this confrontation in his mind: the American cavalry general against the German panzer marshal, New World aggression versus Old World tactical brilliance. It was the duel Patton wanted, the test he craved, and it never happened. In his private journal, Patton wrote that he had hoped to meet Rommel in battle, but was denied that opportunity. There's real regret in those words. Patton respected Rommel perhaps more than any other German commander. Why? What did Patton actually think about Rommel? The answer reveals something fascinating about both men. Patton saw in Rommel a kindred spirit. Both were armor specialists who believed in speed, maneuver, and aggressive action. Both led from the front and inspired fierce loyalty in their troops. Both were personally brave to the point of recklessness. Both had explosive tempers and difficult relationships with their superiors. Both were brilliant tactical commanders with an instinctive understanding of mobile warfare, and both were absolutely convinced of their own genius. Patton didn't just respect Rommel's abilities. He recognized Rommel as his equal, perhaps his only equal, among the generals of World War II. When Patton said, "You magnificent bastard," he wasn't being sarcastic, he meant it, magnificent, worthy. A rival deserving of respect. For a man as competitive and egotistical as Patton, that was the highest compliment imaginable. But there's another layer to Patton's thinking about Rommel. Patton needed Rommel to be a genius because defeating a genius would prove Patton's own greatness. If Rommel was just another competent German general, then beating him wouldn't mean much. But if Rommel was the greatest armor commander in the world, then outsmarting him, anticipating him, defeating him would elevate Patton to legendary status. This is why Patton continued to reference Rommel even after learning he'd left Africa. The myth of fighting Rommel was more useful than the reality of fighting von Arnim. And here's the fascinating thing, Rommel felt the same way about Patton. After the war, when historians interviewed German generals, they were asked about Allied commanders. Which ones did they respect? Which ones did they fear? When it came to Patton, the responses were remarkably consistent. German General Alfred Jodl said he was the American Guderian. He was very bold and preferred large movements. General Fritz Bayerlein, who served under Rommel, said Patton was the most outstanding tactical genius of the war. He had the greatest ability to see immediately what was the right thing to do in an action. But what did Rommel himself think? The two men never met, not in combat, not in person, not even after the war, since Rommel died in 1944. But Rommel's private papers, letters, and journal entries reveal his assessment of Allied generals. He described Montgomery as methodical, cautious, competent, but predictable. He credited Montgomery with never making a serious strategic mistake, which was both praise and criticism. Montgomery didn't lose, but he didn't dazzle either. When Rommel learned about Patton's operations in Tunisia and later in Sicily, his assessment was different. He reportedly told his staff that Patton showed the most dangerous combination of daring and skill among Allied commanders. Rommel recognized in Patton the same aggressive instinct that defined his own command style. If they had met in battle, Rommel wrote, it would have been a struggle of life and death. That wasn't hyperbole, that was professional respect. The tragedy, from a purely military history perspective, is that we'll never know who would have won that confrontation. Patton versus Rommel in North Africa, with roughly equal forces and clear tactical objectives, would have been one of the great battles of the war. Instead, we got Patton versus von Arnim, which wasn't the same thing at all. Von Arnim was competent but conventional. He lacked Rommel's instinct for the decisive moment, the bold maneuver, the calculated risk. The Battle of Guettar could have been a masterpiece of armored warfare. Instead, it was a solid American tactical victory against a poorly executed German counterattack. Not the stuff of legend, but certainly important. It proved American forces could stand and fight. It restored confidence after Kasserine. It set the stage for the final Allied victory in Tunisia on May 13, 1943, when over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. Let's step back and consider what Patton's thoughts about Rommel reveal about the nature of military rivalry and respect. In war, we often think of enemy commanders as simply enemies, obstacles to be overcome, perhaps even hated. But among professional soldiers, especially at the highest levels of command, there's often a different dynamic. A recognition that the man on the other side faces similar challenges, makes similar decisions, carries similar burdens. Patton never met Rommel, but he studied him, thought about him, prepared to fight him with the intensity of a chess grandmaster analyzing a rival's games. That's not hatred. That's profound professional engagement. Patton wanted to beat Rommel, yes, but he also wanted Rommel to be worthy of beating. He needed a dragon to slay, not a windmill to tilt at. This tells us something important about Patton himself. For all his bluster, profanity, and theatrical tough guy persona, Patton was fundamentally an intellectual. He read voraciously. He studied military history obsessively. He wrote poetry, though he'd never admit it publicly. He thought deeply about the nature of courage, leadership, and warfare. When he encountered Rommel's book, he didn't just skim it for tactical tips. He engaged with it as one serious military thinker engaging with another. That's why he felt such a connection to Rommel. It wasn't about nationality or ideology. It was about shared excellence in their chosen profession. They were both artists of war, and artists recognize each other across enemy lines. There's a poignant postscript to this story. After the war, Patton's son, Major General George S. Patton IV, met Rommel's son, Manfred Rommel, who became mayor of Stuttgart, Germany. The two men became friends. They corresponded. They spoke at veterans' events. They represented a kind of reconciliation between former enemies. And both men acknowledged that their fathers, despite fighting on opposite sides, had respected each other profoundly. Manfred Rommel once said in an interview that his father would have enjoyed meeting General Patton because they thought alike about many things. George Patton IV agreed, saying his father always spoke of Rommel with admiration and regretted they never faced each other. That next-generation friendship was built on the foundation of mutual respect that their fathers established without ever meeting. So what did Patton really think about Rommel? He thought Rommel was magnificent, a bastard, yes, in the sense that Rommel was trying to kill American soldiers and advance Nazi conquest, but magnificent nonetheless, brilliant, worthy, dangerous. The kind of opponent who brings out the best in you because anything less than your best will get you killed. Patton was prepared to fight Rommel with more intensity and focus than he brought to any other battle. He studied Rommel's tactics. He anticipated Rommel's moves. He trained his troops to counter Rommel's preferred strategies. And when he thought he'd beaten Rommel at Guettar, his exultation wasn't just about victory. It was about proving himself against the standard he'd set for himself, to be as good as Rommel. The irony that Rommel wasn't actually there doesn't diminish what it reveals about Patton's mindset. Here's the deeper truth. Patton's rivalry with Rommel was as much with himself as with Rommel. He was competing against his own image of what a great general should be. Rommel represented that ideal, aggressive, bold, tactically brilliant, personally courageous, respected by friends and enemies alike. Patton wanted to be that, needed to be that. The rivalry with Rommel was Patton's way of measuring himself against the highest standard he could imagine. When he said, "I read your book," he was really saying, "I'm ready, I've done the work. I deserve to stand on the same battlefield with you." It was about earned respect, both ways. Patton respected Rommel enough to prepare thoroughly. And by preparing thoroughly, Patton believed he earned Rommel's hypothetical respect in return. The question that haunts military historians is, what would have actually happened if they'd met in battle? If Rommel had stayed in North Africa another month, if he'd been commanding German forces at Guettar or the subsequent battles, who would have won? We can speculate based on their records. Rommel was more experienced in desert warfare, having commanded in North Africa for 2 years. But Patton had better logistics, more tanks, air superiority, and fresh troops. Rommel was sick and exhausted. Patton was energized and aggressive. Rommel fought brilliant defensive battles when outnumbered. Patton excelled at offensive operations when he had the advantage. It would have depended on terrain, timing, intelligence, and luck. In other words, it could have gone either way, which is exactly why it would have been such a fascinating battle. But perhaps the fact that they never met is fitting. Their rivalry exists in that perfect space of potential, never tested, never resolved. Both men could believe they would have won. Both men's admirers can argue that their general was superior. There's no definitive answer, which means the legend persists. In mythology and military history, the battles that never happened sometimes become more famous than the ones that did. Achilles and Hector, Arthur and Lancelot, Patton and Rommel. The duel that defines both men precisely because it never occurred. What we're left with is two legendary generals, each respecting the other from a distance, each preparing to face the other with maximum seriousness, each recognizing in the other a mirror of their own martial excellence. That's not a rivalry defined by hatred or ideology. It's a rivalry defined by professional recognition of mastery, the kind of rivalry that elevates both participants even when they never meet. In May 1943, the North African campaign ended. The Americans and British captured Tunisia. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered, including all that remained of Rommel's once mighty Afrika Korps. It was a decisive Allied victory. Patton moved on to command the 7th Army in Sicily, then the 3rd Army in France. He raced across Europe, becoming one of the most famous American generals of the war. Rommel returned to Germany, took command of defenses in France, fought against the D-Day invasion, and was eventually implicated in the plot to assassinate Hitler. He was forced to take poison in October 1944 and died a German hero spared public disgrace by Hitler's twisted sense of loyalty. The two men never saw each other, never spoke, never exchanged a single direct communication, and yet their rivalry shaped both their campaigns and their legacies. What does this tell us about war, rivalry, and respect? It tells us that even in the most brutal human endeavor, there's room for professional admiration. That enemies can recognize excellence in each other, that competition can coexist with respect. Patton and Rommel fought on opposite sides of a war that determined the fate of civilization. Their ideologies were incompatible. Their nations were mortal enemies. But as practitioners of the art of war, they understood each other in ways that transcended politics and nationalism. They shared a language of tactics, strategy, movement, and decision-making that created a bond across enemy lines. That bond didn't make them friends. It didn't make the war less terrible or the stakes less absolute, but it did create a space for a kind of respect that's rare in human conflict. So when we ask what Patton really thought about Rommel, the answer is complex and human and fascinating. He thought Rommel was the opponent he needed to prove himself against, the standard, the test. The one man whose defeat would mean something, and because they never met, that need was never satisfied. Patton beat German forces in North Africa, Sicily, and across Europe. He became a legend. But somewhere in his mind, there was always the unanswered question, what if? What if he'd faced Rommel at Guettar? What if the Desert Fox had been there, commanding those panzers, making those decisions? Would the outcome have been the same? We'll never know. And that uncertainty, that eternal what if, is exactly what keeps this story alive 80 years later. What do you think? If Patton and Rommel had met in battle with equal forces, who would have won? Was Patton right to build up Rommel in his mind as the ultimate opponent, or was it just psychological warfare against himself? And does it matter that the famous quote, "I read your book," was said about a battle Rommel didn't even command? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story gave you a new perspective on these legendary generals, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of military history. Next time, we'll explore another moment of near collision between military titans, another rivalry that shaped the course of history. Until then, remember, sometimes the battles that never happen tell us more about warriors than the ones that do.